All right. So we're just waiting for my Instagram thing to have me live. Let's see. Oh, I can add a title. Reading short stories. And am I live? How do I know? YouTube, give me a moment. I haven't done Instagram Live in quite a long time. There we are. Okay. Now there we are. We are live on Instagram, and we are live on YouTube, and of course, Twitch. So if you have any interest in this, then welcome. I'm glad to see you. Figured it's a snowy day here in Brooklyn and Queens and all of New York City, and I thought, I like to read in general, and I thought maybe I could read some stories with some of my friends on a snowy day. Because I am who I am and I do what I do, I do have a beer for the occasion, as I like to do. I have Stillwater's Premium Postmodern beer. We're not going to go in depth in a beer review, just, I thought it'd be nice to have something to gently sip. And I see that some of my friends are joining. It's good to have you here. Thank you. I appreciate each and every one of you, whether you're able to tune in live or if you're joining after the fact. This beer, like most of the beers I drink on these, was lovingly selected with the help of my friend at Beer Street, New York. A lovely little beer shop in Brooklyn, Williamsburg area, and lovely people. This smells delicious. I wish that you could have a sip with me. So I'm going to, I think first we're going to read a selection from JG Ballard's The Terminal Beach. And that is really crisp and refreshing. That's so nice. That's a very subtle drink, but nice. So I really like these old paperbacks. The artwork on them is just lovely. I like everything about that. When I was on the radio in Portland, there was a program directly after mine called Terminal Beach. So, of course, when I found this in a bookshop here in Brooklyn, this wonderful little shop is called Human Relations on Flushing Avenue. Recommended highly. I knew I had to have this little paperback. Given the era in which Ballard, did much of his writing, I recall one of the stories in here had some language that I was not fond of, a reflection of its time. Much like I'm not even going to try to read from the collection of Lovecraft stories I have. Certain things don't resonate with our modern views. But that's okay. It doesn't entirely invalidate them. It just means that I'm not going to read those words live on the internet. Although H.P. Lovecraft was kind of a horrible human being. So we're going to read the titular story here, Terminal Beach, from The Terminal Beach by JG Ballard. I hope that you enjoy the story, find it relaxing, or whatever else applies. It's pretty dim lighting in my room, so bear with me if my cadence isn't perfect. I'm the person who decided to light their room with string lights and nothing else. But it's good to see you. So this is, again, called The Terminal Beach. At night, as he lay asleep on the floor of the ruined bunker, Traven heard the waves breaking along the shore of the lagoon, like the sounds of giant aircraft warming up at the ends of their runways. This memory of the great night raids against the Japanese mainland had filled his first months on the island with images of burning bombers falling through the air around him. Later, with the attacks of Berry, the nightmare passed, and the waves began to remind him of the deep Atlantic rollers on the beach at Dakar, where he had been born, and of watching from the window in the evenings for his parents to drive home along the Corniche road from the airport. Overcome by this long-forgotten memory, he woke uncertainly from the bed of old magazines on which he slept and went out to the dunes that screened the lagoon. Through the cold night air, he could see the abandoned super-fortresses lying along the palms beyond the perimeter of the emergency landing field 300 yards away. Traven walked through the dark sand, already forgetting where the shore lay, although the atoll was little more than half a mile in width. Above him, along the crests of the dunes, the tall palms leaned into the dim air like the symbols of a cryptic alphabet. The landscape of the island was covered by strange ciphers. My phone seems to have gone to sleep. Are we still live? Oh, we paused due to poor connection. There we are. We're back on Instagram. My apologies, friends. Giving up the attempt to find the beach, Traven stumbled onto a set of tracks left years earlier by a large Caterpillar vehicle. The heat released by the weapons tests had... Oh my goodness. It does not want to stay connected on Instagram. The heat released by the weapons tests had fused the sand, and the double line of fossil imprints uncovered by the evening air wound its serpentine way among the hollows like footfalls of an ancient saurian. Too weak to walk any further, Traven sat down between the tracks. Hoping that they might lead him to the beach, he began to excavate the wedge-shaped grooves from a drift into which they disappeared. He returned to the bunker shortly before dawn and slept through the hot silences of the following noon. The blocks. As usual on these enervating afternoons, when not even a breath of onshore breeze disturbed the dust, Traven sat in the shadow of one of the blocks, lost somewhere within the center of the maze. His back resting against the rough concrete surface, he gazed with a phlegmatic eye down the surrounding aisles and at the line of doors facing him. Each afternoon, he left his cell in the abandoned camera bunker among the dunes and walked down into the blocks. For the first half an hour, he restricted himself to the perimeter aisle, now and then trying one of the doors with the rusty key in his pocket, found among the litter of smashed bottles and cans in the isthmus of sand separating the testing ground from the airstrip, and then inevitably, with a sort of drugged stride, he set off into the center of the blocks, breaking into a run and darting in and out of the corridors, as if trying to flush some invisible opponent from his hiding place. Soon, he would be completely lost. Whatever his efforts to return to the perimeter, he always found himself once more in the center. Eventually, he would abandon the task and sit down in the dust, watching the shadows emerge from their crevices at the foot of the blocks. For some reason, he invariably arranged to be trapped when the sun was at zenith. Aniawatok, the thermonuclear noon. One question in particular intrigued him. What sort of people would inhabit this minimal concrete city? The synthetic landscape. Please let me know if you're watching on Instagram if this is working at all. I feel like it keeps dimming and cutting out. If you're on YouTube, I do imagine this is working just fine. Oh, that's a lovely beard. Thank you for being here. This island is a state of mind, Osborne, one of the scientists working the old submarine pens, was later to remark to Traven. The truth of this became obvious to Traven within 2 or 3 weeks of his arrival. Despite the sand and the few anemic palms, the entire landscape of the island was synthetic, a man-made artifact with all the associations of a vast system of derelict concrete motorways. Since the moratorium on atomic tests, the island had been abandoned by the Atomic Energy Commission, and the wilderness of weapons, isles, towers, and blockhouses ruled out any attempt to return it to its natural state. There were also stronger unconscious motives that Travin recognized. If primitive man felt the need to assimilate events in the external world to his own psyche, 20th century man had reversed this process. By this Cartesian yardstick, the island at least existed, in a sense true of few other places. But apart from a few scientific workers, no one yet felt any wish to visit the former testing ground. And the naval patrol boat anchored in the lagoon had been withdrawn 3 years before Travin's arrival. Its ruined appearance and the associations of the island with the period of the Cold War, what Travin had christened the Pre-Third, were profoundly depressing. An Auschwitz of the soul, whose mausoleums contained the mass graves of the still undead. With the Russo-American detente, this nightmarish chapter of history had been gladly forgotten. The Pre-Third. The actual and potential destructiveness of the atomic bomb placed straight into the hands of the unconscious. The most cursory study of the dream life and fantasies of the insane shows that ideas of world destruction are latent in the unconscious mind. Nagasaki, destroyed by the magic of science, is the nearest man has yet approached to the realization of dreams that even during the safe immobility of sleep are accustomed to develop into the nightmares of anxiety. Glover, from War, Sadism, and Pacifism. The Pre-Third. The period was characterized in Travin's mind, above all, by its moral and psychological inversions, by its sense of the whole of history, and in particular of the immediate future, the 2 decades, 1945 through 65, suspended from the quivering volcano's lip of World War III. Even the death of his wife and 6-year-old son in a motor accident seemed only part of this immense synthesis of the historical and psychic zero. The frantic highways where each morning they met their deaths, the advance causeways to the global Armageddon. Third beach. He had come ashore at midnight after a hazardous search for an opening in the reef. The small motorboat he had hired from an Australian pearl diver at Charlotte Island subsided into the shallows, its hull torn by the sharp coral. Exhausted, Travin walked through the darkness among the dunes, where the dim outlines of bunkers and concrete towers loomed between the palms. He woke the next morning into bright sunlight, laying halfway down the slope of a wide concrete beach. This ringed an empty reservoir or target basin some 200 feet in diameter, part of a system of artificial lakes built down the center of the atoll. Leaves and dust choked the exit grills, and a pool of warm water 2 feet deep lay below him, reflecting a distant line of palms. Travin sat up and took stock of himself. This brief inventory, which merely confirmed his physical identity, was limited to little more than his thin body in its frayed cotton garments. In the context of the surrounding terrain, however, even this collection of tatters seemed to possess a unique vitality. The desolation and emptiness of the island, and the absence of any local fauna, were emphasized by the huge sculptural forms of the target basins set into its surface. Separated from each other by narrow isthmuses, the lakes stretched away along the curve of the atoll. On either side, sometimes shaded by the few palms that had gained a precarious purchase in the cracked cement, were roadways, camera towers, and isolated blockhouses, together forming a continuous concrete cap upon the island. A functional megalithic architecture was as gray and minatory, and apparently as ancient in its projection into and from time future as any of Assyria and Babylon. What It's very long sentences, bear with me. The series of weapons tests had fused the sand in layers, and the pseudo-geological strata condensed the brief epochs, microseconds in duration, of thermonuclear time. Typically, the island inverted the geologist's maxim, the key to the past lies in the present. Here, the key to the present lay in the future. This island was a fossil of time future, its bunkers and blockhouses illustrating the principle that the fossil record of life was one of armor and the exoskeleton. Travin knelt in the warm pool and splashed his shirt and trousers. The reflection revealed the watery image of gaunt shoulders and bearded face. He had come to the island with no supplies other than a small bar of chocolate, assuming that in some way the island would provide its own sustenance. Perhaps, too, he had identified the need for food with a forward motion in time, and that with his return to the past, or at most into a zone of non-time, this need would be eliminated. The privations of the previous 6 months during his journey across the Pacific had already reduced his always thin body to that of a migrant beggar, held together by little more than the preoccupied gaze in his eye. Yet this emaciation, by stripping away the superfluities of the flesh, revealed an inner sinewy toughness, an economy and directness of movement. For several hours, Travin wandered about, inspecting one bunker after another for a convenient place to sleep. He crossed the remains of a small landing field, next to a dump where a dozen B-29s lay across one another like dead reptile birds. The corpses. Once he entered a small street of metal shacks, containing a cafeteria, recreation rooms, and shower stalls. A wrecked jukebox lay half buried in the sand behind the cafeteria, a selection of records still in their rack. Further along, flung into a small target lake 50 yards from the shacks, were the bodies of what at first he thought were the former inhabitants of this ghost town. A dozen life-size plastic models. Their half-melted faces, contorted into bleary grimaces, gazed up at him from the jumble of legs and torsos. On either side of him, muffled by the dunes, came the sound of waves, the great rollers on the seaward side breaking over the reefs and onto the beaches within the lagoon. However, he avoided the sea, hesitating before any rise or dune that might take him within its sight. Everywhere, the camera towers offered him a convenient aerial view of the confused topography of the island, but he avoided their rusting ladders. Travin soon realized that however random the blockhouses and towers might seem, their common focus dominated the landscape and gave to it a unique perspective. As he noticed when he sat down to rest in the window slit of one of the bunkers, all these observation posts occupied positions on a series of concentric perimeters, moving in tightening arcs toward the inmost sanctuary. This ultimate circle, below ground zero, remained hidden beyond a line of dunes a quarter of a mile to the west. I've been asked what we're reading. We are reading The Terminal Beach from the collection, The Terminal Beach by JG Ballard. The Terminal Bunker. After sleeping for a few nights in the open, Travin returned to the concrete beach where he had woken on his first morning on the island and made his home, if the term could be applied to the damp, crumbling hovel, in a camera bunker 50 yards from the target lakes. The dark chamber between the thick-canted walls, tomb-like though it might seem, gave him a sense of physical reassurance. Outside, the sand drifted against the sides, half burying the narrow doorway, as if crystallizing the immense epoch of time that had elapsed since the bunker's construction. The narrow rectangles of the 5 camera slits their shapes and positions determined by the instruments, studded the west wall like runic ideograms. Variations on these ciphers decorated the walls of the other bunkers, the unique signature of the island. In the mornings, if Traven was awake, he would always find the sun divided into its 5 emblematic beacons. Most of the time, the chamber was filled only by a damp, gloomy light. In the control tower at the landing field, Traven found a collection of discarded magazines and used the end. One day, lying in the bunker shortly after the first attack of Berry, he pulled out a magazine pressing into his back and found inside it a full-page photograph of a 6-year-old girl. This blonde-haired child, with her composed expression and self-immersed eyes, filled him with 1,000 painful memories of his son. He pinned the page to the wall and gazed at it through his reveries. For the first few weeks, Traven made little attempt to leave the bunker and postponed any further exploration of the island. The symbolic journey through its inner circles set its own times of arrival and departure. He evolved no routine for himself. All sense of time soon vanished, and his life became completely existential, an absolute break separating one moment from the next like 2 quantal events. Too weak to forage for food, he lived on the old ration packs he found in the wrecked super fortresses. Without any implement, it took him all day to open the cans. His physical decline continued, but he watched his spindling legs and arms with indifference. By now, he had forgotten the existence of the sea and vaguely assumed the atoll to be part of some continuous continental table. 100 yards to the north and south of the bunker, a line of dunes, topped by the palisade of enigmatic palms, screened the lagoon and sea, and the faint, muffled drumming of the waves at night had fused with his memories of war and childhood. To the east was the emergency landing strip and the abandoned aircraft. In the afternoon light, their shifting rectilinear shadows made them appear to writhe and pivot. In front of the bunker, where he would sit, was the system of target lakes, the shallow basins extending across the atoll. Above him, the 5 apertures looked upon this scene like the tutelary symbols of a futuristic myth. Take a sip of water. Oh wait, Instagram sure doesn't want to work with us today. Maybe we won't do Instagram next time I do one of these. The lakes and the specters. The lakes had been designed to reveal any radiobiological changes in a selected range of fauna, but the specimens had long since bloomed into grotesque parodies of themselves and been destroyed. Sometimes in the evenings, when a sepulchral light lay over the concrete bunkers and causeways, and the basins seemed like ornamental lakes in a city of deserted mausoleums, abandoned even by the dead, he would see the specters of his wife and son standing on the opposite bank. Their solitary figures appeared to have been watching him for hours. Although they never moved, Traven was sure they were beckoning. In his reverie, he would stumble forward across the dark sand to the edge of the lake and wade through the water, shouting soundlessly at the 2 figures as they moved away hand in hand among the lakes and disappeared across the distant causeways. Shivering with cold, Traven would return to the bunker and lie on the bed of old magazines, waiting for their return. The image of their faces, the pale lantern of his wife's cheeks, floated on the river of his memory. The blocks, too. It was not until he discovered the blocks that Traven realized he would never leave the island. At this stage, some 2 months after his arrival, Traven had exhausted his small cache of food, and the symptoms of beriberi had become more acute. The numbness in his hands and feet and the gradual loss of strength continued. Only by an immense effort and the knowledge that the inner sanctum of the island lay unexplored did he manage to leave the palace of magazines and make his way from the bunker. As he sat in the drift of sand by the doorway that evening, he noticed a light shining through the palms far into the distance around the atoll. Confusing this with the image of his wife and son, and visualizing them waiting for him at some warm hearth among the dunes, Traven set off towards the light. Within 100 yards, he lost his sense of direction. He blundered about for several hours on the edges of the landing strip and succeeded only in cutting his foot on a broken Coca-Cola bottle in the sand. After postponing his search for the night, he set out again in earnest the next morning. As he moved past the towers and blockhouses, the heat lay over the island in an unbroken mantle. He had entered a zone devoid of time. Only the narrowing perimeters warned him that he was crossing the inner field of the fire table. He climbed the ridge, which marked the furthest point in his previous exploration of the island. From the plain below it, the recording towers rose into the air like obelisks. Traven walked down towards them. On their gray walls were the faint outlines of human forms in stylized poses, the flash shadows of the target community burnt into the cement. Here and there, where the concrete apron had cracked, a line of palms hung in the motionless air. The target lakes were smaller, filled with broken bodies of plastic models. Most of them lay in the inoffensive domestic postures into which they had been placed before the tests. Beyond the furthest line of dunes, where the camera towers began to turn and face him, were the tops of what seemed to be a herd of square-backed elephants. They were drawn up in precise ranks in a hollow that formed a shallow corral, the sunlight reflected off their backs. Traven advanced toward, limping on his cut foot. On either side of him, the loosening sand had excavated the dunes, and several of the blockhouses tilted on their sides. This plain of bunkers stretched for some quarter of a mile. The half-submerged hulks bombed out into the surface in some earlier test, like the abandoned wombs that had given birth to this herd of megaliths. The blocks, part 3. To grasp something of the vast number and oppressive size of the blocks and their impact upon Traven, one must try to visualize sitting in the shade of one of those concrete monsters or walking about in the center of their enormous labyrinth that extended across the central table of the island. There were 2,000 of them, each a perfect cube 15 feet in height, regularly spaced at 10-yard intervals. These were arranged in a series of tracts, each composed of 200 blocks, inclined to one another and to the directions of the blast. They had weathered only slightly in the years since they were first built, and their gaunt profiles were like the cutting face of a gigantic die plate, devised to stamp out sectilinear volumes of air the size of a house. 3 of the sides were smooth and unbroken, but the 4th, facing away from the blast, contained a narrow inspection door. It was this feature of the blocks that Traven found particularly disturbing. Despite the considerable number of doors, by some freak of perspective, only those in the single side were visible at any point within the maze. As he walked from the perimeter line in the center of the massif, line upon line of the small metal doors appeared and receded. Approximately 20 of the blocks, those immediately below ground zero, were solid. The walls of the remainder were of varying thicknesses. From the outside, they appeared to be of uniform solidity. As he entered the first of the long aisles, Traven felt the sense of fatigue that had dogged him for so many months began to lift. With their geometric irregularity and finish, the blocks seemed to occupy more than their own volumes of space, imposing on him a mood of absolute calm and order. He walked on into the center of the maze, eager to shut out the rest of the island. After a few random turns to the left and right, he found himself alone, the vistas to the sea, lagoon, and island closed. Here he sat down with his back to one of the blocks, the quest for his wife and son forgotten. For the first time since his arrival at the island, the sense of dissociation set off by its derelict landscape began to recede. With dusk, and the need to leave the blocks and find food, he realized that he had lost himself. However, he retraced his steps, struck out left or right in an oblique course, oriented himself around the sun, and pressed on resolutely north or south. He found himself back again at his starting point. Only when darkness came did he manage to make his escape. Abandoning his former home near the aircraft dump, Travin collected together what canned food he could find in the waste turret and cockpit lockers of the superfortresses. He pulled them across the atoll on a crude sledge. 50 yards from the perimeter of the blocks, he took over a tilting bunker and pinned the fading photograph of the blonde-haired child to the wall beside the door. The page was falling to pieces, like a fragmenting mirror of himself. Since the discovery of the blocks, he had become a creature of reflexes, kindled from levels above those of his existing nervous system. If the autonomic system was dominated by the past, Travin sensed the cerebrospinal reach toward the future. Each evening when he woke, he would eat without appetite and then wander among the blocks. Sometimes he took a canteen of water with him and remained there for 2 or 3 days on end. The submarine pens. This precarious existence continued for the following weeks. As he walked out to the blocks one evening, he again saw his wife and son, standing among the dunes below a solitary camera tower, their faces watching him expressionlessly. He realized that they had followed him across the island from their former haunt among the dried-up lakes. At about this time, he once again saw the distant light beckoning, and decided to continue his exploration of the island. Half a mile further along the atoll, he found a group of 4 submarine pens, built over an inlet, now drained, which wound through the dunes from the sea. The pens still contained several feet of water, filled with strange luminescent fish and plants. The warning light winked at intervals from the apex of a metal scaffold. The remains of a substantial camp, only recently vacated, stood on the pier outside. Greedily, Travin heaped his sledge with the provisions stored inside one of the metal shacks. With this change of diet, the beriberi receded, and during the next days he returned often to the camp. It appeared to be the site of a biological expedition. In the field office, he came across a series of large charts of mutated chromosomes. He rolled them up and took them back to his bunker. The abstract patterns were meaningless, but during his recovery, he amused himself by devising suitable titles for them. Later, passing the aircraft dump on one of his forays, he found the half-buried jukebox and tore the list of records from the selection panel, realizing that these were the most appropriate captions. Thus embroidered, the charts took on many layers of associations. Travin, in parenthesis. Elements in a quantal world. The terminal beach. The terminal bunker. The blocks. The landscape is coded. Entry points into the future equal levels in a spinal landscape equal zones of significant time. August 5th. Found the man Travin, a strange derelict figure, hiding in a bunker in the deserted interior of the island. He is suffering from severe exposure and malnutrition, but is unaware of this or, for that matter, of any other events in the world around him. He maintains that he came to the island to carry out some scientific project, unstated, but I suspect that he understands his real motives and the unique role of the island. In some way, its landscape seems to be involved with certain unconscious notions of time, and in particular with those that may be repressed premonition of our own deaths. The attractions and dangers of such an architecture, as the past has shown, need no stressing. August 6th. He has the eyes of the possessed. I would guess that he is neither the first nor the last to visit the island. From Dr. C. Osborne, in a Ewok Diary. Travin lost within the blocks. With the exhaustion of his supplies, Travin remained within the perimeter of the blocks almost continuously, conserving what strength remained to him to walk slowly down their empty corridors. The infection in his right foot made it difficult for him to replenish his supplies from the stores left by the biologists, and as his strength ebbed, he found progressively less incentive to make his way out of the blocks. The system of megaliths now provided a complete substitute for those functions of his mind which gave to it its sense of the sustained rational order of time and space. Without them, his awareness of reality shrank to little more than the few square inches of sand beneath his feet. On one of his last ventures into the maze, he spent all night and much of the following morning in a futile attempt to escape. Dragging himself from one rectangle of shadow to another, his leg as heavy as a club and apparently inflamed to the knee, he realized that he must soon find an equivalent for the blocks, or he would end his life within them, trapped inside this self-constructed mausoleum as surely as the retinue of Pharaoh. He was sitting helplessly somewhere in the center of the system, the faceless lines of tomb booths receding from him, when the sky was slowly divided by the drone of a light aircraft. This passed overhead and then returned 5 minutes later. Seizing his opportunity, Traven struggled to his feet and made his exit from the blocks, his head raised to follow the faintly glistening beacon of the exhaust trail. As he lay in the bunker, he dimly heard the aircraft return and carry out an inspection of the site. A belated rescue. Who? Do you realize you're on your... Traven, I've had some sort of accident. I'm glad you flew over. I'm sure you are. Why didn't you use our radio telephone? Anyway, we'll call the Navy and have you picked up. No. Traven sat up on one elbow and felt weakly in his hip pocket. I have a past somewhere. I'm carrying out research. Into what? The question assumed a complete understanding of Traven's motives. He lay in the shade under the lee of the bunker and drank weakly from a canteen as Dr. Osborne dressed his foot. You've also been stealing our stores. Traven shook his head. 50 yards away, the striped blue Cessna stood on the concrete apron like a brilliant dragonfly. I didn't realize you were coming back. You must be in a trance. The young woman sitting at the controls of the aircraft climbed out and walked over to them. She glanced at the gray bunkers and towers and seemed uninterested in the decrepit figure of Traven. Osborne spoke to her, and after a downward glance at Traven, she went back to the aircraft. As she turned, Traven rose involuntarily, recognizing the child in the photograph he had pinned to the wall of the bunker. Then he remembered that the magazine could not have been more than 4 or 5 years old. The engine of the aircraft started. As Traven watched, it turned onto one of the roadways and took off into the wind. Later that afternoon, the young woman drove over to the blocks by jeep and unloaded a small camp bed and a canvas awning. During the intervening hours, Traven had slept. He woke refreshed when Osborne returned from his scrutiny of the surrounding dunes. What are you doing here? The young woman asked as she secured the guy ropes to the roof of the bunker. Traven watched her move about. I'm searching for my wife and son. They're on this island? Surprised, but taking the reply at face value, she looked around her. Here? In a manner of speaking. After inspecting the bunker, Osborne joined them. The child in this photograph, is she your daughter? Traven hesitated. No, she's adopted me. Unable to make any sense of his replies, but accepting his assurances that he would leave the island, Osborne and the young woman drove back to their camp. Each day Osborne returned to change the dressing, driven by the young woman, who seemed now to grasp the role cast for her by Traven. Osborne, when he learned of Traven's previous career as a military pilot, appeared to suspect that he might be a latter-day martyr left high and dry by the moratorium on thermonuclear tests. A guilt complex isn't an indiscriminate supply of moral sanctions. I think you may be overstretching yours. When he mentioned the name Etherly, Traven shook his head. Undeterred, Osborne pressed. Are you sure you're not making similar use of the image of Eniwatok, waiting for your Pentecostal wind? Believe me, Doctor, no, Traven replied firmly. For me, the hydrogen bomb was a symbol of absolute freedom. I feel it's given me the right, the obligation even, to do anything I want. That seems strange logic, Osborne commented. Aren't we at least responsible for our physical selves, if for nothing else? Not now, I think, Traven replied. After all, in effect, we are men raised from the dead. Often, however, he thought of Etherly, the prototypal pre-third man, dating the pre-third from August 6, 1945, carrying a full load of cosmic guilt. Shortly after Traven was strong enough to walk, he had to be rescued from the blocks for a second time. Osborne became less conciliatory. Our work is almost complete, he said warningly. You'll die here, Traven. What are you looking for among these blocks? To himself, Traven murmured, the tomb of the unknown civilian, Homo hydrogenesis, an Iwatok man. Doctor, he said, your laboratory is at the wrong end of this island. Tartly, Osborne replied, I'm aware of that, Traven. There are rarer fish swimming in your head than in any submarine pen. On the day before they left, the young woman drove Traven over to the lakes where he had first arrived. As a final present, an ironic gesture unexpected from their elderly biologist, she had brought from Osborne the correct list of legends for the chromosome charts. They stopped by the derelict jukebox, and she pasted them onto the selection panel. They wandered among the supine wrecks of the superfortresses. Traven lost sight of her, and for the next 10 minutes searched in and out of the dunes. He found her standing in a small amphitheater formed by the sloping mirrors of the solar energy device built by one of the visiting expeditions. She smiled to Traven as he stepped through that scaffolding. A dozen fragmented images of herself were reflected in the broken panes. In some, she was San's head. In others, multiples of her arms circled about her like the serpent limbs of a Hindu goddess. Confused, Traven turned and walked back to the jeep. As they drove away, he recovered himself. He described his glimpses of his wife and son. Their faces are always calm, he said. My son's particularly, though really he was always laughing. The only time his face was grave was when he was being born. Then he seemed millions of years old. The young woman nodded. I hope you find them. As an afterthought, she added, Dr. Osborne is going to tell the Navy that you're here. Hide somewhere. Traven thanked her. From the center of the blocks, he heard to her the following day when she flew away for the last time. The name of the party. When the search party came for Traven When the search party came for him, Traven hid in the only logical place. Fortunately, the search was perfunctory and was called off after a few hours. The sailors had brought a supply of beer with them, and the search soon turned into a drunken ramble. On the walls of the recording towers, Traven later found balloons of obscene dialogue chalked into the mouths of the shadowy figures, giving their postures the priapic gaiety of the dancers in cave drawings. The climax of the party was the ignition of a store of gasoline in an underground tank near the airstrip. As he listened, first to the megaphone shouting his name, the echoes receding among the dunes like forlorn calls of dying birds, then to the boom of the explosion and the laughter as the landing craft left, Traven felt a premonition that these were the last sounds he would hear. He had hidden in one of the target basins, lying among the broken bodies of the plastic models. In the hot sunlight, their deformed faces gaped at him, sightlessly from a tangle of limbs, their blurred smiles like those of the soundlessly laughing dead. Their faces filled his mind as he climbed over the bodies and returned to the bunker. As he walked towards the blocks, he saw the figures of his wife and son standing in his path. They were less than 10 yards from him, their white faces watching him with a look of almost overwhelming expectancy. Never had Traven seen them so close to the blocks. His wife's pale features seemed illuminated from within. Her lips parted as if in greeting, one hand raised to take his own. His son's face, with its curiously fixed expression, regarded him with the same enigmatic smile of the child in the photograph. Judith, David. Startled, Traven ran forwards to them. Then, in a sudden movement of light, their clothes turned into shrouds, and he saw the wounds that disfigured their necks and chests. Appalled, he cried out. As they vanished, he ran off into the safety of the blocks. The Catechism of Goodbye. This time he found himself, as Osborne had predicted, unable to leave the blocks. Somewhere in the center of the maze, he sat with his back against one of the concrete flanks, his eyes raised to the sun. Around him the lines of cubes formed the horizon of his world. At times they would appear to advance towards him, looming over him like cliffs, the intervals between sorrowing so that they were little more than an arm's length apart, a labyrinth of corridors running between them. They then would recede from him, separating from each other like points in an expanding universe, until the nearest line formed an intermittent palisade among the horizon. Time had become quantal. For hours it would be noon, the shadows contained within the blocks, the heat reflected off the concrete floor. Abruptly he would find that it was early afternoon or evening, the shadows everywhere like pointing fingers. "Goodbye, Eniwatok," he murmured. Somewhere there was a flicker of light, as if one of the blocks, like a counter on an abacus, had been plucked away. "Goodbye, Los Alamos." Again, a block seemed to vanish. The corridors around him remained intact, but somewhere in his mind had appeared a small interval of neutral space. "Goodbye, Hiroshima. Goodbye, Alamogordo. Goodbye, Moscow, London, Paris, New York." Shuttles flickered, a ripple of lost integers. He stopped, realizing the futility of this megathlon farewell. Such a leave-taking required him to fix his signature upon every one of the particles of the universe. Total noon, Eniwatok. The blocks now occupied positions on an endlessly revolving circus wheel. They carried him upwards into the sky, from where he could see the whole island and the sea, and then down again through the opaque disk of the concrete floor. From here he looked up at the undersurface of the concrete cap, an inverted landscape of rectilinear hollows, the dome-shaped mounds of the lake system, the thousands of empty cubic pits of the blocks. Goodbye, Traven. Near the end, he found to his disappointment that this ultimate rejection gained him nothing. In the interval of lucidity, he looked down at his emaciated arms and legs, decorated with a lacework of ulcers. To his right was a trail of disturbed dust, the wavering marks of slack heels. To his left lay a long corridor between the blocks, joining an oblique series 100 yards away. Among these, where a narrow interval revealed the open space beyond, was a crescent-shaped shadow, poised in the air above the ground. During the next half an hour, it moved slowly, turning as the sun swung the profile of a dune. The crevice. Seizing on this cipher, which hung before him like a symbol on a shield, Traven pushed himself through the dust. He climbed precariously to his feet and shielded his eyes from the blocks. He moved forward a few paces at a time. 10 minutes later, he emerged from the western perimeter of the blocks like a tottering mendicant, leaving behind a silent desert city. The dune lay 50 yards in front of him. Beyond it, bearing the shadow like a screen, was a ridge of limestone that ran away among the hillocks of the wasteland beyond this point of the atoll. The remains of an old bulldozer, bales of barbed wire, and 50-gallon drums lay half buried in the sand. Traven approached the dune, reluctant to leave this anonymous swell of sand. He shuffled around its edges and sat down in the mouth of a shallow crevice below the brow of the ridge. After dusting his clothes, he gazed out patiently at the great circle of blocks. 10 minutes later, he noticed that someone was watching him. The maroon Japanese. This corpse, whose eyes stared up at Traven, lay to his left at the bottom of the crevice, that of a man of middle age and strong build. It rested on its back with its head on a pillow of stone, hands outstretched at its sides, as if surveying the window of the sky. The fabric of the clothes had rotted to a bleached gray vestment, but in the absence of any small animal predators on the island, the skin and musculature of the corpse had been preserved. Here and there, at the angle of a knee or wrist, a bony point glinted through the leathery integument of the skin, but the facial mask was still intact and revealed a male Japanese of the professional classes. Looking down at the strong nose, high forehead, and broad mouth, Travin guessed that the Japanese had been a doctor or a lawyer. Puzzled as to how the corpse had found itself here, Travin slid a few feet down the slope. There were no radiation burns on the skin, which indicated that the Japanese had been there for 5 years or less, nor did he appear to be wearing a uniform, so had not been some unfortunate member of a military or scientific party. To the left of the corpse, within reach of his left hand, was a frayed leather case, the remains of the map wallet. To the right was the husk of a haversack, open to reveal a canteen of water and a small mess tin. Travin slid down the slope until his feet touched the splitting soles of the corpse's shoes, the reflex of starvation making him for the moment ignore that the Japanese had deliberately chosen to die in the crevice. He reached out and seized the canteen. A cupful of flat water swilled around the rusting bottom. Travin gulped down the water, the dissolved metal salts cloaking his lips and tongue with a bitter film. The mess tin was empty, except for a tacky coating of condensed syrup. Travin prized the lid and chewed at the tarry flakes, letting them dissolve in his mouth with an almost intoxicating sweetness. After a few moments, he felt lightheaded and sat back beside the corpse. Its sightless eyes regarded him with unmoving compassion. The fly. A small fly, which Travin presumes has followed him into the fissure, now buzzes about the corpse's face. Guiltily, Travin leans forward to kill it, then reflects that perhaps this minuscule sentry has been the corpse's faithful companion, in return fed on the rich liquors and distillations of its pores. Carefully, to avoid injuring the fly, he encourages it to alight on his wrist. Dr. Yasuda. Thank you, Travin. In my position, you understand. Travin. Of course, Doctor. I'm sorry I tried to kill it. These ingrained habits, they're not easy to shrug off. Your sister's children in Osaka in 44. The exigencies of war. I hate to plead them. Most known motives are so despicable, one searches the unknown and hope that... Yasuda. Please, Travin. Do not be embarrassed. The fly is lucky to retain its identity for so long. That son you mourn, not to mention my own 2 nieces and nephew, did they not die each day? Every parent in the world grieves for the lost sons and daughters of their earlier childhoods. Travin. You're very tolerant, Doctor. I wouldn't dare. Yasuda. Not at all, Travin. I make no apologies for you. Each of us is a little more than a meager residue of the infinite unrealized possibilities of our lives. But your son and my nephew are fixed in our minds forever, their identities as certain as the stars. Travin, not entirely convinced. That may be so, Doctor, but it leads to a dangerous conclusion in the case of this island. For instance, the blocks. Yasuda, they are precisely what I refer to, Travin. Here among the blocks, you at last find an image of yourself free of the hazards of time and space. This island is an ontological Garden of Eden. Why seek to expel yourself into a world of quantal flux? Travin, excuse me. The fly has flown back to the corpse's face and sits in one of the dried-up orbits, giving the good doctor an expression of quizzical beadiness. Reaching forward, Travin entices it onto his palm. He examines it carefully. Well, yes, these bunkers may be ontological objects, but whether this is the ontological fly is doubtful. It's true that on this island it's the only fly, which is the next best thing. Yasuda. You can't accept the plurality of the universe. Why, Travin? Why should this obsess you? It seems to me that you are hunting for the white leviathan. 0. The beach is a dangerous zone. Avoid it. Have a proper humility. Pursue a philosophy of acceptance. Traven. Then may I ask why you came here, doctor? Yasuda. To feed this fly. What greater love? Traven, still puzzling. It doesn't really solve my problems. The blocks, you see. Yasuda. Very well, if you must have it that way. Traven. But doctor. Yasuda. Peremptorily. Kill that fly. Traven. That's not an end or a beginning. Hopelessly he kills the fly. Exhausted, he falls asleep beside the corpse. The terminal beach. Searching for a piece of rope in the refuse dump behind the dunes, Traven found a bale of rusty wire. After unwinding it, he secured a harness around the corpse's chest and dragged it from the crevice. The lid of a wooden crate made a crude sledge. Traven fastened the corpse to it in a sitting position and set off along the perimeter of the blocks. Around him, the island remained silent. The lines of palms hung in the sunlight, only his own motion varying the shifting ciphers of their crisscrossing trunks. The square turrets of the camera towers jutted from the dunes like forgotten obelisks. An hour later, when Traven reached the awning by his bunker, he untied the wire cord he had fastened around his waist. He took the chair left for him by Dr. Osborne and carried it to a point midway between the bunker and the blocks. Then he tied the body of the Japanese to the chair, arranging the hands so they rested on the wooden arms, giving the moribund figure a posture of calm repose. This done to his satisfaction, Traven returned to the bunker and squatted under the awning. As the next days passed into weeks, the dignified figure of the Japanese sat in his chair 50 yards from him, guarding Traven from the blocks. He now had sufficient strength to rouse himself at intervals and forage for food. In the hot sunlight, the skin of the Japanese became more and more bleached, and Traven would wake at night and find the sepulchral figure sitting there, arms resting at its sides, in the shadows that crossed the concrete floor. At these moments, he would often see his wife and son watching him from the dunes. As time passed, they came closer, and he would sometimes find them only a few yards behind him. Patiently, Traven waited for them to speak to him, thinking of the great blocks whose entrance was guarded by the seated figure of the dead archangel, as the waves broke on the distant shore and the burning bombers fell through his dreams. Well, that's tonight's story. Takes a little longer to read a short story when we read it out loud, doesn't it? So again, that was we read the title story, Terminal Beach, from The Terminal Beach by JG Ballard. It's a hell of a read. I realized that my cadence may have been a little off a couple times. This you can tell my room is pretty dimly lit, and this print is small. The book just finally fell apart. This book is from the 60s. I will reattach it to itself eventually. But I think that the existential weight of a story like that reflects interestingly during pandemic and quarantine and being shut in during a snowstorm. I haven't read that story probably in a year and a half, and I've read it 2 or 3 times before this, and it's chilling, isn't it? I think that I will read more stories soon, but I think for tonight we're gonna call that, because that was a long story, and I saw that not everybody enjoyed it as I did, but I will do this again all the same. Perhaps next time just on YouTube. Instagram doesn't seem to cooperate terribly well. But excuse me. I thank you for your companionship. And if there is, at any point, a story that you would like for me to read, we'll find a way for me to be put in touch with that story, won't we? And I'll read with you, to you. I don't know if my voice is terribly soothing or anything, or any of that, but we find ways to connect as we can, don't we? So I'm Ben, as you probably know, and thanks for spending an hour with me reading a nice little story. I will see you soon. Turning off the phone first, and we're gonna turn off YouTube and Twitch. Thank you so much, guys. Appreciate you.